Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome once again to the SportsPro Podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. Hope you're well. We have a bit of a special edition of the podcast, I guess you could call it this time. We are introducing our 50 most marketable athletes of 2020. Here to do the job for me or with me and take us through the list and some of the changes that we've made this year and some of the thinking behind that. Please welcome SportsPro Deputy Editor Sam Carp. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Eoin. How are you doing?
I'm not too bad, Sam. Where in the world are you? Are you back in SportsPro Towers?
I am indeed. I'm not sure if I've just incriminated myself by admitting to that, but I am indeed back in the SportsPro Towers in London. A little bit quieter than it was when you and I were last in here together in March, but nice for a change of scene at least, anyway.
Yeah, well, stay safe. I'm sure you're doing everything you should be, Sam, as ever. And also, we're very happy to welcome our partners in this particular endeavour. Salvatore Deangelis, who's the head of digital at Nielsen Sports International. Welcome, Salvatore.
Hi, hello. Thank you for having me. Nice to meet you.
Now, Salvatore's here because we're doing things a little bit differently this year, Sam, from basically at any point in the history of the list. I know there's been a little bit of evolution in the feature in the last couple of years to bringing a little bit more data, but this is probably the most decisive change in the whole time we've done this. Maybe you could just take us through a little bit of how we've come at the most marketable athletes list this year.
Yeah, quite. I suppose you could describe it as quite a drastic change to the extent that I was almost taken aback a little bit upon seeing the first draft. But I guess it does go to show how we have measured things a little bit differently this year. In the past we've used different metrics like value for money, age, home market, willingness to be marketed, all of that sort of coupled with an awful lot of educated guesswork, I suppose you could say. And then this year the focus is very much on sponsorship related KPIs such as social following, content engagement, fan base growth over time, media value, and the performance of branded versus organic content. So I guess if you look at the way we did it in the past, we were kind of trying to pick out athletes with potential over the coming 3 years based on various things in terms of what major events they had coming up, their trajectory up to that point. And I suppose it wasn't necessarily focused as much on the big names as it was on those with the potential to become them. Whereas now I suppose there is a little bit more of an element of looking back. The data that's been used to form this list is from over the past 12 months. So there's obviously the way that it's been structured is based on those names that have been sort of doing the most on their social media platforms in that period. So I guess it doesn't necessarily lend itself as much to some of those more unknown names that maybe might represent big value for brands in that sort of 3-year time frame that we used to use. But at the same time, it does give a very good indication of those athletes that are kind of dominating the marketing space at the moment.
Yeah, so that's the decisive, that's the underlying change, is that we've shifted from the old model of you've got an endorsement contract to give somebody, it's a 3-year term, who is going to represent the best value for money for you over that 3 years, and obviously there was a degree of kind of editorial guidance to that, and so we kind of went for some balance. We obviously got input and we had data to inform that as well, but we were looking for a spread and trying to get a picture of the whole sports ecosystem. This time, as you say, it's much more a ranking of who is most effective right now today in the endorsement space.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess what I should have mentioned as well is that there were kind of the 4 R's which were used to generate the list, kind of those ideas of reach, relevance, resonance, and return, which I guess are four magic R words that are becoming of increasing importance to sports marketers in the world that is becoming more and more dominated by social media platforms. And I guess you think of how fans are engaging with their favorite athletes at the moment. It is on Instagram, it is on Twitter, it is maybe less on Facebook, but it's on those places where they can post their own content. And I think that tells in the list, the big names that are on there. I think in the past we've maybe even eked them out slowly. Some have made a reappearance this year, but it does go to show that those millions and millions of followers that they do have still represent significant value to those brand partners. They don't necessarily represent a bargain for new sponsors looking to partner with them, but for those that took a gamble on them early, they're still incredibly effective.
And obviously we'll get Salvatore to dive into some of the methodology in just a second. Just to give an idea of the makeup of the list, Lionel Messi is at the top, followed in short order by Cristiano Ronaldo, LeBron James, and Virat Kohli. Bianca Andrewski, Canadian tennis player and former US Open champion, is at number 5. So that's the first of the kind of names that you might have found jostling for space in some of those older lists. Whereas the first 4 very much fitting the bill of 4 of the absolute biggest sports stars in the world. And I think the rest of the list is probably quite a reflection of that. And Sam will return to that in a little while. But Salvatore, what constitutes the methodology of this? How did you approach the problem of trying to find out who the most marketable athletes in the world are?
Yeah, good question. Good question. Thanks for that. As Sam just anticipated, basically we started from our 4R perspective, meaning this reach, relevance, resonance, and return framework. These are basically the 4 key dimensions that brands are considering when working with influencers in general, meaning in the entertainment space, in the sports space. In general, when working with influencers, these 4 are the key dimensions that are able to give you, a full picture of the potential of specific personalities for your brand. So we try to adapt that logic to sports. In order to do that, we basically searched for all the athletes. We analyzed more than 6,000 athletes, including 21 sports from every single country in the market, in the globe, in the world, basically, and trying to understand the performance of each one of them from a different perspective. So just to give you an idea, we have more than 15 data points in that. By combining all these data points together, we were able now then to calculate the reach, relevance, resonance, and the return score for each one of them, and then rank them up to understand the top 50. And we have a very diverse group in that. You mentioned big names like Messi and Ronaldo, but we also have other younger athletes that are growing a lot in the last 12 months. And in general, the impact that these athletes are delivering with organic content and with branded content with brands is outstanding. So definitely something that we took into consideration was also the impact in terms of engagement that these athletes were able to provide when working with brands, on top of followers, as we mentioned, on top of engagement rate, growth in terms of fan base in the last 12 months, mentions across the entire web, engagement on Instagram. So there is a lot of data in there, and it's also funny to see how to combine all of these together to build up the list.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of things there that I think are probably quite important to factor into the conversation. One is that you are not just comparing athletes with one another anymore within the same spaces, and even among sports fans, you're weighing up whether you're working with an athlete or working with an influencer, be that someone who's a particularly influential fan or somebody who exists among a sports following or is a health and fitness influencer, what have you. There's a whole range of different profiles out there. And then the other side of it is the way that endorsement deals are structured now, and the way that marketing spend is trending is away from this kind of, okay, we're going to sign a deal that gives us a measure of exclusivity when it comes to working with a particular athlete, and more towards, okay, how can we assign digital spend in order to get a return that we have a reasonable ability to be able to anticipate.
Yeah, exactly. These are two key dimensions, and this is also something that is is translating from in general entertainment and consumer brands world to sports as well. Because basically, these athletes have been able to build the most extensive fan base in the world. Just if you consider the top five in our list, we have half a billion fans as a cumulative audience. So it's a very impressive. But the other really relevant point is that on average, their growth in terms of fan base is almost 40%. So they are extremely popular and they are getting more fans every day. And this is definitely something that is super interesting to brands because on one hand they can activate new contents, they can on platforms, they can use athletes, work with athletes for their audiences. So it's a completely different level of communication, and it's more like something that is already in place in brands and consumer brands when working with influencers. So we try to establish exactly the same approach, treating athletes like influencers, because at the end of the day, they are influencers and they are influencing people all around the world.
You talked about that growth of audience. What were some of the other data trends that you discovered in this exercise?
Well, just to give you, well, it's been a really tough year, for everyone and for sports in particular. So we have seen a lot of users like interacting with well established athletes. So it's not the case that Messi, Ronaldo, and LeBron James are ranking among the top three of this list, because starting from their huge fan base, millions of followers on fan base, they were able to increase that fan base even more. But also the engagement rate was impressive, because if you take into consideration again the top five of our list, basically the average engagement rate is 7%, which is huge. Just to give you a quick benchmark, usual with influencers, a very good engagement rate is 2.53%. So when you have a multi-million fan base with an average engagement rate of 7%, it means that you have a huge potential to activate your content. So engagement rate was definitely another super interesting data point, as long as all the conversations and the incredible level of positive sentiment in the entire web across these related to these athletes. So good level of interactions, amazing level of interactions, and positive sentiment, positive conversations around them were definitely key trends of this list.
Now, Sam, one of the other things that's changed as a result of compiling the list in this way is that for you guys editorially, instead of building the picture up first of all and then kind of starting to think about who might be on the list, you're presented with the list, and then you've got to interpret from that some of the trends that are going through the industry at this moment in time. You have been working on that over the last few weeks. What are some of the things that you've picked out there?
Well, one of the first ones that I immediately jumped out at me is kind of, I know you touched on it before, kind of Bianca Andrewski being the first name in there who I guess sort of would fit that traditional 50mm mold, in the sense that she is that kind of up and comer. And if you sort of looked at it more broadly in terms of tennis, the list sort of suggests that the future of tennis is female in a way. It's no surprise to see football and the NBA dominate the list, as I think athletes from those sports have done in the past. But after that, you have tennis, which is the third best represented, with 6 athletes, and of those 6, 4 are female, and the other 2 are Federer and Nadal. So I think we've spent a lot of time in the past few years trying to guess, who's going to be the next Federer. Then you look at other sports, who's going to be the next Messi, who's going to be the next Ronaldo. And the conversation in tennis, I guess, has always been who is going to replace this unbelievably talented and also unbelievably marketable generation that we've been treated to in the last sort of 1.5 decades. And I guess according to the list, no one in men's tennis is about to do that. Not Zverev, not Thiem, who we've put in there before. At least according to the list, I guess the veterans who are still going represent the better value. And then you turn your attention to women's tennis. You see Andreescu there, who won her first Grand Slam in September last year. She's not only the the highest ranked tennis player in the list. She's the highest ranked female in the list at number 5. She's experienced 573% follower growth in the last 12 months. She is followed up by Coco Gauff at 18, I believe, whose social following has gone up by 923% after she burst onto the scene at Wimbledon last year. And then that's without even mentioning last year's number 1 Naomi Osaka and then Ash Barty as well, who both feature a little lower down the list. So I think just in terms of tennis specifically, that was a particularly interesting trend that I picked out, because I mean, obviously it's something that we've been talking about for a long time, about who the next star in tennis is going to be, and maybe there's been a particular focus on the men's side, but I guess this list kind of speaks to the fact that the next star isn't coming from the men. The next stars are all coming up on the female side and within the WTA. So, and I think the cases of Andrewski and Gauff are particularly interesting because they have sort of experienced such monumental rises so quickly, as those percentages that I referenced before kind of speak to. And obviously their partners are likely going to be reaping the benefits of getting in there early with them.
The other thing, just looking at the female athletes who are represented in the list, and this is something that has in common with lists we've done in the past. Some of the names are slightly different, but generally speaking, you have, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, 2 athletes from team sports in there, in Megan Rapinoe and Alex Morgan, and then the rest, and women are pretty well represented in the list, which I think is probably another thing we can follow up on. But the rest are all from individual sports. So tennis, a couple of gymnasts in there, Simone Biles and Caitlin Ohashi. You've got surfers and a skateboarder in there, in young Sky Brown. But it is women in individual sports, and team sports doesn't seem to have created the same platform.
Not yet, I guess. I think this was also something that I mentioned last year when we put the list together, and that obviously, I suppose over the last 12, 18, 24 months, when there has been kind of this exponential rise in women's sport, both in terms of its following, its popularity, the kind of media deals, the sponsorship deals that have been done, it's always been important to remember that it is still at a very sort of nascent stage compared to the men's, which I think is why when you do look at a list like this, it is kind of those individuals who have done something extraordinary already in their specific sports that are still the ones that kind of come on the most attention on those platforms. I mean, that's not too far detached from some of the male names in this list, but I think, as you say, if you were to look across the team sports in women's sport, there would be less sort of recognition for some of those bit time players, and I guess those ones which really aren't sort of transcending the sport. But I think that, again, as I say, that's only because women's sport is still so early in its commercial development. So I think while that is obviously quite an apparent trend from the list, it's not a massively surprising one. But I think as the list evolves over the coming years, you would see more female athletes from team sports creeping onto it.
I mean, the other thing that's that it speaks to, I guess, is what Salvatore was talking about, which is social media space in particular being very much about personal influence. But I do wonder, Salvatore, if there's any kind of, if you think about the almost everyone who's involved from a team sport is playing for a team that has an enormous profile of its own. So they're standing on the shoulders of that brand, if you like, and their own profile grows from that. Was there anything that you read into that particular phenomenon?
Well, there are a couple of interesting facts also linking to what Sam was talking about a couple of minutes ago. So yeah, first of all, it's quite rare to have athletes from teams to be bigger than the teams. It happens, like Cristiano Ronaldo for Juventus, or Hamilton. You would say he's also even bigger than Formula One itself, but it's not so common. So definitely yes, the brands are also the team brands are also helping the athletes develop their own fan base. But an interesting point also on the women's and on the female athletes that we have on the list, is that basically when we talk about Coco Gauff, when we talk about all these young athletes, Naomi Osaka and so on and so forth, we also have a really interesting thing to say that basically from a demographic standpoint, their follower base is slightly younger than other athletes. And this younger audience, meaning the Gen Z, let's say classically, are more loyal to personalities than teams and brands. So this is, in my opinion, something that is really key also in understanding how now this trend is happening and what to expect in the future.
Join the conversation with the SportsPro community. Follow us on Twitter @SportsPro. Find us on Instagram @sportspro.media. And connect to SportsPro Media on LinkedIn, where you can also become a part of our specialist OTT community. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
Sam, anything else that caught your eye?
Yeah, I mean, I think it almost goes back to what you were saying about the individual sports, but I think I've counted 6 from action sports on there. You've got 3 surfers, 1 skateboarder, particularly young skateboarder that is, in Sky Brown, who might just be the youngest ever to appear on 50 Most Marketable. Probably right in saying.
Yeah, I think we might have put a block on people under the age of 18 before, but you can't argue with the data, I suppose.
No, and then 1 skier and a snowboarder. And I think that just again goes to show that brands are getting particularly good value from athletes in those disciplines. I think that's a trend that has emerged in recent years as well with the list. Not necessarily coming from mainstream sports, but those athletes are typically, they're more dependent on brands for sponsorship income to obviously support their earnings. They're not getting quite as much from their wages. So those athletes are naturally more active promoters compared to their counterparts in your footballs and your basketballs and Formula One, for example, who get paid large sums of money by their teams anyway, and obviously command higher endorsement fees. So I think, that's sort of something that I noticed carried through from the last few editions into this one, and was obviously kind of backed up by Nielsen's data. So I think that's particularly interesting for brands when they're looking at signing an athlete. You don't necessarily have to look to the top of the table to those mainstream sports, but if there is a specific type of audience that they do want to reach, then athletes in those niche sports do still represent some very significant value.
Yeah, and I guess as well, there's the lifestyle element, isn't there? These are, generally speaking, sports with an audience that is participative. A lot of fans of that athlete and fans of that sport will also take part in it, or they will have some other interest in the culture. When we're looking at sports like surfing and skateboarding, even tennis to an extent, there is that side of it. And so, particularly again, if you're looking at things through a social prism and you're looking at audience segmentation being a factor and all that kind of thing, and relevance being a factor, then that's got to play into it as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, if you consider, let's take as an example Formula One, for instance. In the list, we have Hamilton and Leclerc. And if you have a look at their Instagram profile, you can immediately see how the contents about lifestyle are overperforming, meaning all the contents with the fashion brands they are collaborating with. It's not a case that these two are the key, let's say, drivers that we included in the list. Definitely the lifestyle, the fashion brands especially are investing a lot in working with athletes, developing capsule collection tailor-made with them, having campaigns fully delivered together with them. In some cases, athletes are also designing clothes, shoes, and so on. So it's definitely, this integration is definitely moving something in the audience, and in this way athletes are even more appealing than ever, because this mix between lifestyle and sports is becoming extremely relevant, especially outside of sports, bringing at the end of the day new audience into sports.
Yeah, and we have Catherine Davistotta down there at 45, who's a CrossFit champion, as if kind of to underline that point about lifestyle. But one of the other things, Sam, it feels like in certain sports, as you probably wouldn't be too surprised, it's very much the kind of tentpole stars who emerge, the absolute pillars of those sport who would be recognizable to people outside that fan base and transcend that sport. I'm thinking of people like the two boxers who are in here, Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua.
Yeah, for sure. You've got those guys. If you look at NFL as well, Tom Brady's back in there, alongside a slightly younger quarterback in Pat Mahomes, who we actually overlooked for last year's list, which looks like a massive mistake to make in hindsight. But yeah, again, it's sort of, as you say, is while I think sports like football, like basketball, there is kind of room for those young up and comers. I mean, you do have AJ and Tyson Fury on the list, who, as we know here in the UK, have very much been dominating the boxing conversation in the past year, and are kind of the names in the heavyweight boxing division now. But also you have Ryan Garcia up there, in at number 12, I believe. Who,
yeah, I did miss that. I was about to correct myself, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few, a couple of UFC representatives in there. So I guess combat sports as well is one that I guess has had significant growth in the past sort of 4 or 5 years. You go back to Conor McGregor when he used to feature pretty highly in the list. I think around that time there was a sort of shift in interest in combat sports. It sort of coincided with the emergence of AJ as well, and just I think that sort of content that is shared around boxing and combat sports is very snackable. It makes its way around social media very quickly, and guys like Joshua, guys like Fury, they've come to represent something a little bit greater. Like as Salvatore was touching on before with the lifestyle element. I think when you look at boxing and you look at Joshua, you've got the kind of superhero element of it. With Tyson Fury, you've got the whole entertainment package. Not many athletes in sport grab hold of the microphone after they've won one of the biggest events of their lives and start singing a song in front of a packed out crowd. So there is, I think, in those sports there has emerged these characters which do resonate with a younger audience, and on those social media platforms where those younger audiences are, tend to sort of create content which gets shared a lot more readily.
Yeah, I think we've probably got time to go over a couple of other ideas, Sam. Was there anything else that jumped out?
Well, I think when you're looking at a list like this, it's always very easy to notice the people that aren't in there, as well as the ones that are. So I think even more broadly for those involved in sport that might be reading the list, it's worth considering, maybe why their sport isn't represented. So if I think back to assembling previous editions of the list, there was always a feeling that we have to have a golfer in there, or maybe two or three golfers. We have to have an Olympic sprinter in there. We have to have an MLB player in there. And you look at this year's list, there are no golfers in there. There are no MLB players in there. There's one track and field athlete in Asher Smith. These are really, really big sports where historically athletes have commanded seriously big commercial dollars. And as I say, in previous editions of 50 Most Marketable would have formed quite a large portion of it. So I guess it's worth wondering why they're not represented in this one. Why the data says that they aren't actually in. No one from baseball, no one from golf is actually one of the most marketable athletes in the world, and maybe it's worth those sports considering how they can better market those athletes now. Why is it maybe that golfers don't resonate quite as much on social platforms? Why is it that baseball players aren't sort of generating the same number of retweets, the same number of followers on their accounts? Perhaps it speaks to sort of a new age of marketing, I guess, in the sense that in the past that 50mm list was very much done on the traditional ways of marketing, whereas now it is very much moving towards social. So perhaps those sports that have been able to bank on the old ways of doing things are actually going to have to start to adapt, and in order to keep their athletes relevant in the public eye.
And I think there are some ideas that we've had and that we've discussed with people in compiling these lists before that are borne out by some of the things here. I mean, if you think in terms of geography and the relative scale of markets, you have Virat Kohli and Rohit Sharma, both Indian cricketers, in the top 10. If you think about the engagement of, we have a lot of football players in there, we have a lot of basketball players in there, which I think is pretty consistent with what you would think about the relative profiles of those sports. And and the interest in athletes within those sports. And something that we've said is that you could quite happily fill this list in the past with 25 footballers and 25 basketball players, and you'd not be that far off. And then the other is the age of certain athletes. And, you talked about a couple already, but you look at somebody like Erling Haaland, or individuals within sports where there might be more prominent people in there, but their age profile and their personality connects with people who are very heavily engaged socially.
Yeah, I think that's something that hasn't changed about this list as well. Within you mentioned Haaland there. I think he's right alongside Mbappe in the list. There are those guys within those really, really popular sports who are kind of staking a claim to make their way higher up the list. So if you were to look to some of those other sports that are included, then they're sort of going to break free of that 50 to 40, 40 to 30 mold. But I think if you look between 10 and 30, within there, you've kind of got a collection of athletes who could potentially in the next 3 years be that number one. I think Haaland was another one whose social media following grew exponentially over the past 12 months. I think it was more than 1,000%. And you just kind of look at the kind of character that he is. He's only 20 years old. He's incredibly confident. Seems to, his interviews seem to go viral almost after every single game, as do all the goals that he scores. So you kind of look at him as the potential for one who has that combination of talent, personality, the kind of social media savvy about him to kind of break into that top five, maybe even go to one in the coming years. Because, I guess the likes of Messi and Ronaldo are up there because they've built that following up over time as a result of just being very, very good at what they do. Whereas I think, as you say now, it's got to be a combination of all those things in order to become one of the most popular and sort of most followed athletes in the world.
If you look at how the list is being built, it's crystal clear how you have well-established athletes in the same sport. I mean, you have the well-established athletes and the younger stars from a social perspective in the same space, basically, because talking about football, as we were mentioning before, you have Cristiano Ronaldo, you have Messi, but then you have Haaland. And basically you can see how these two different generation of players are now basically really close to each other in the social space. Of course, we are talking about two complete different audiences in terms of fan base, because you have 100 more millions followers for Ronaldo and you have 4 million followers for Haaland. But the engagement potential of Haaland is really, really great. And the same applies to the NBA when you have Zion Williamson and you have LeBron James, Hamilton for Formula One, and Charles Leclerc, and Federer and Nadal and Naomi Osaka go golf. So this is exactly what is really, really characteristics to this list. We have a combination of well-established athletes and younger athletes in the same sport that are basically really generating outstanding results through social media. In my opinion, this is really reflecting how the social media ecosystem is working now.
And you mentioned his name there, and I think very much evocative of the shift in outlook this year. I think this is Roger Federer's first appearance on the list.
Be delighted.
We decided already to look past him back in 2010. Sam, any final thoughts?
Not in particular, to be honest. I think on the whole, I think it's a very, very interesting list. I think like every year, people are going to disagree with it. People are going to find things that they like about it, find things that they don't like. And I know that I actually did. I'm sure that you did, Owen. It was quite interesting to look at it, with more of a critical hat on for a change, rather than having to, completely defend it to the hills like we have in previous years. But I think yeah, it's a very interesting list, as Salvatore has been saying, with a great balance of kind of those top names and the emerging stars that are kind of going to shape the sporting conversation in the years to come. So yeah, I think lists are always there to be disagreed with, the number of questions that it throws up. So I think it's just as well that we've had Salvatore here with us to answer some of those.
Yeah, and I think this is one to be interpreted, I think, more than disagreed with this time. But Salvatore, anything that you'd add?
No, basically just to confirm once again, in our opinion, this is really reflecting how social media ecosystem is working right now, with Instagram leading the way when it comes to interacting with personalities. Instagram is really key platform where all these interactions between audience users and personalities are happening. So definitely, a very good example of how things are working in digital between them. And also, there is another trend, just really last point. During 2020, with the COVID situation and with sports being stopped basically for months, we have seen how these well-established athletes, like the top one we already mentioned, were able to gain more followers. Like, they were really playing a key role, like reference points for audience for that sports. And at the same time, we saw other players, younger players, jumping into the conversation, producing really creative content and branded content with brands, and thanks to that, bringing new audience in the sports. So this year has been quite unique, and also the way how athletes have basically interacted with users across the year has been quite unique. And in my opinion, this is absolutely reflected in the list.
Okay, well, there is more coverage of the list. You can explore it in full on sportspromedia.com as ever. And for the first time this year, we're going to be expanding the 50 most marketable concept and taking a look at brands and at sports properties over the next couple of weeks. So there'll be more of that on this podcast, and there'll be more as well on the site. But for now, we will leave it at that. And I will say thank you to Sam Carp.
Thank you, Eoin. Pleasure being here.
Pleasure having you back, Sam. Thank you to Salvatore De Angelis.
Thank you. Thanks to you.
And thanks to all of you for listening. We'll be back with you again very soon. Bye-bye.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.